Welcome to a phenomenal edition of Rebellion's educational series. I'm here with Carl Herzog, brilliant naval historian, who's the public historian for the USS Constitution Museum, one of the most knowledgeable minds I've come across in the tall ship world. Carl, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me, Alex. It's great to be here.
Absolutely a pleasure. So let's get right to the heart of it. Why is the USS Constitution such an American icon and naval icon?
Oh, wow. Well, there's a million different answers for that. I think one of the probably biggest answers is that USS Constitution and its story really is iconic in the sense that it reaches out into every aspect of the story of the American experience. Quite frequently, older ships that are preserved have one story, one short blast at fame, and are resurrected. Constitution has a story that continues across more than 200 years of history. It begins with the founding of the U.S. Navy in the 1790s, at a time when the U.S. had essentially disbanded the Continental Navy that had helped it through the Revolution, and then had to come back and say, okay, we need these to protect American commerce around the globe.
It does say that we must have a standing Navy at all times.
Yeah, and it was not quite an agreement at the time by any stretch of the imagination. The idea of a standing Navy, not only with its cost, but also with the shadow of tyranny that came with the prospect of a standing military, was something a lot of Americans were loath to dive back into, having just shed off the yoke of that sort of British tyranny. But American commerce was also trying to get back onto the world stage, and in the absence of the protection that it had had from the British Royal Navy prior to the Revolution, they were struggling. Now, the British were certainly not eager to have Americans back on the scene, and smaller state actors were eager to prevent the Americans from doing that, or take advantage of the fact that American merchant ships didn't have that protection. And all of this occurs in the backdrop of the broader conflicts that were going on and reinvigorating themselves between Britain and France at the time. And so the original 6 frigates, of which Constitution was one, that were authorized in 1794, were eventually being built with the belief that they were going to go into the Mediterranean to protect American merchants from what have become known as the Barbary Corsairs, essentially one step above pirates who were enforcing passage through the Mediterranean for American merchant ships. But nobody wanted to have a standing Navy to do that. And in fact, one of the things that made it possible for Congress to get enough votes to approve that construction was the idea that if peace was made there and these ships were considered no longer necessary, that construction wouldn't be completed. And in fact, when they did come to a diplomatic agreement, construction stopped on half of the ships, but immediately at the same time, the situation in the Caribbean was getting more tenuous, because France, now back at war with Britain, saw American interest in neutrality and Americans' interest in trading both with Britain and France to be sort of a violation of the treaties that America had signed with France prior to the Revolution as a treaty of amity. But France had changed. The France of 1796 was not the same France that America had signed those agreements with. The debacle of the French Revolution and all of its complex overturns and violence had occurred in the meantime, and American government didn't quite see the new French Republic as being the same government they had signed those agreements with.
As Alexander Hamilton said, we signed a treaty with Louis, and Louis is dead. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly it. And so as a result, even though these ships were initially built with the Mediterranean in mind, it was the Caribbean that Constitution and the other ships and the other initial ships that were either built, converted from merchant ships, or just bought outright, went to the Caribbean to begin protecting shipping. France had seized like 300 some odd American merchant ships in that first year. And the American merchant trade throughout the Caribbean islands and colonies had been going on for decades and decades, back to the early 1700s, very actively, regardless of who owned what islands. And so a lot of American merchants just did not, really see this in the same kind of sort of, bilateral way that that it was being seen. And they were just eager to trade with everybody as best as they could. So the ships went down there, and that was really America's, first real naval foray. No sooner was that resolved, and they were off to the Mediterranean again, because those issues with the Barbary states had re-arose, and there again, Constitution and her sister ships began to make a mark for themselves. It's fascinating that the quasi-war with France, Constitution's first real outing, is often, not really seen or recognized for its significance. Instead, there tends to be a focus on the Barbary conflict, which had its own share, obviously, of real dramatic adventures that led to the creation of sort of the heritage lore of the U.S. Navy and certainly the U.S. Marines. But all of that then lends itself to the War of 1812, where Constitution really develops its reputation. But when you talk about, going back to your original question about an icon, that reputation and that that achievement and the notoriety that the ship gained in its successful battles against the Royal Navy in the War of 1812 certainly brought it up in elevation. But even after that, it's the ship's constant, persistent presence in the American story that I think really does make it iconic. When she won those battles in 1812, strategically, in terms of winning the War of 1812, Constitution's defeat of a handful of British frigates in the middle of the Atlantic, was not the tipping point for the War of 1812 by any stretch of the imagination, strategically or tactically. But what it did do was create a morale boost and a sense of pride in the Navy, the new Navy, and by extension, a sense of pride in this still relatively new nation that could not be matched. The captains, Hull, Bainbridge, Stewart, were just treated as heroes ashore. The souvenirs, the prizes, the parades, the ship became a rallying point. It became a symbol not only of the new Navy, but of America itself. And I think that kind of continues to this day. But it has continued to be that symbol at all of these points after that. She circled the globe in the 1840s in a mission, that was partly diplomacy, part flying the flag, part, making new agreements with foreign nations. She served endlessly in squadron patrols defending American commerce, and again being there as part diplomat and part just a presence of the flag in the Mediterranean and the Caribbean and the South Pacific. The first U.S. consul general to the nation of Egypt was delivered by USS Constitution. The ship, as I said, circled the globe in the 1840s. In the 1850s, its last active capture was an American slave ship, because the ship had been stationed in the West Africa Squadron to stifle the already illicit trade of enslaved people from West Africa to the United States. And then in the 1860s, when all of the Civil War breaks out, where's Constitution? She's serving as a training ship for the new U.S. Naval Academy, first in Annapolis, and then relocating and serving as a base for the Navy Academy in Newport, Rhode Island, while the Civil War goes on. And then into the 1870s and 1880s, she's still sailing. She's on international missions, delivering things to the Paris exhibition, training young sailors as late as the 1880s, young boys for whom this was a sort of cadet experience that would lead them into enlisted positions in the Navy afterwards. And then even after she arrives in Boston, she continues sort of to be that iconic presence from her 100th anniversary of her launch in 1897, when national petitions were put out to save her, to the 1920s, when another restoration was needed just before the Depression. And school children helped fund it by raising pennies, collecting pennies that they donated to help with the preservation and restoration of the ship, all of which occurred right before the crash of 1929. It's such a contingency of history that had that restoration been scheduled just a little bit later, it may not have happened. But since it did, here was this brand new, ship that was now in good enough shape to transit to different ports. And at the height of the Depression, the US sent Constitution on a national tour from Maine all the way down into the Gulf, through the Panama Canal, and all the way up the West Coast to Seattle, so that Americans could see what they paid for and also serve as sort of a patriotic, sense of heritage again, and rallying cry at a really dark economic time in the nation's history. At the museum, we have scrapbooks of a lot of the active duty Navy sailors who, as young men, participated on that national tour, and a number of whom ended up in the Pacific during World War II later on. And at every port that they went to, they were the headline, literally, in the newspapers, and millions of people came to visit them and sort of embrace that. And that has continued. 1997, she made national news again, sailing under her own power for the first time since 1885 for the 200th anniversary of her launch. So when we talk about icons, we tend to focus on these just discrete events. Yes, she beat the British Navy and the Navy frigates in the War of 1812, but her iconography is tied into all of America.
But the British Admiralty also changed their rules of engagement. The Royal Navy would no longer allow one ship to take on one American ship. It had to be 2-on-1.
Yeah, well, part of that was that there was the uniqueness. One of the things that makes Constitution a real significant feature of naval ship history is that it was kind of an innovative design. No single element of its design was innovative in its own right, but the combination definitely was. This was a flush deck frigate, much larger than a lot of the typical frigates that Britain was using around the globe, and carrying much heavier guns and more of them. And that design was a product of the hybrid nature, of the needs of this young Navy. Yeah, the Royal Navy had 500 plus ships, right? And so they had a lot of ships that could fill distinct roles. The 74-gun ship of the line was sort of the workhorse of the British Navy, but they had huge numbers of them that could perform, in lines of battle and in fleet circumstances. And they had much smaller frigates, 32-gun frigates, that were sort of the scouts and outer reach. America couldn't build a fleet. They're building a small number of ships. So they focused instead on a hybrid design that would ideally meet both those needs.
The wood was fantastic. I mean, can we talk about the wood?
Yeah, well, that is part of it. It's the design, it's the construction materials, and how they were all employed together. So you're looking at a ship that is substantially larger than a frigate, but still has a bottom profile that'll provide it with a lot of speed, but the strength to carry enough guns to get itself out of trouble with larger ships and still have the speed to get in and out if it needed to. And so the elements that went into that were in part a longer keel and a longer overall length of hull. And then you had the need to sort of make that long hull a stable, solid platform. And to do that, they relied on a set of framing made not from white oak from the northern United States, but from live oak, which grows in the southern coastal region. Live oak is substantially denser and heavier than white oak, but it was also a lot more difficult to acquire. And so that those heavier framing contributed to sort of that strength and durability. And then a set of diagonal frames, those diagonal riders were installed that essentially stretch out from the center line at the keel up toward the bow and the stern as they rise up to the upper decks. And that strength prevented the hogging of the ship, with less flotation at the bow and the stern. Hulls of ships had a tendency to sort of bow out on either end, and that was going to be especially an issue with a ship like Constitution that was carrying 24-pound long guns, 32-pound carronades, and so to have that extra support and stability was absolutely necessary. But the combination made it a ship that the British did not initially recognize. And looking out over the horizon, in an eyeglass, you're like, oh, it's a frigate, we're good to go. And then they get in and like, what kind of frigate is this? They've been called the super frigates. Some historians refer to them, kind of in a reference to later World War II ships as sort of, it was the pocket battleship, the pocket ship of the line of the U.S. Navy for that period.
It's funny, the two most visited ships in the world are the Constitution and the Vasa. And yet one is the ultimate success story, surviving hundreds of years and providing inspiration to her country, while the other one is the ultimate failure, I guess.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's absolutely true. I think that's part of the appeal, though. I think the one thing that they have in common is, and for the Vasa, it's a matter of circumstance, is that they remain intact and they remain, pretty much able to present themselves as the experience of what they were. Vasa is an archaeologist's dream, obviously.
not a doubt. No, it's on my bucket list.
Yeah. I've actually never been there either. But I've certainly known people who have done work on that hull, and it's just fascinating. And the whole story behind it is so compelling, and their capability of creating a museum experience around it is certainly compelling too. In the case of Constitution, it's similar in that it is the ship itself that brings people back. But like Vasa, that has a story, albeit a story of failure. Constitution and its story is what brings people and attracts people to it as well too. The ship, still has people who come back to it, active duty sailors, for retirements and celebrations, and exactly what you're saying, bucket lists for people.
It's one of our national treasures.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and that's one of the reasons it's maintained. The ship is a representation of not only naval heritage but American heritage in that sense.
In ancient Greece, they preserved the ship of Theseus for 500 years to commemorate one of their great battles. And Constitution, barely. We're not anywhere near 500 years yet.
No, we're about halfway there. Yeah.
Making our way. So this was a really absolutely great conversation, and credit goes to USS New Jersey curator Ryan Szymanski for the diagonal rider question. I just wanted to let you know he offered me that, and
that's great.
And also credit goes to my friend Admiral Scott Sanders, who taught me about the change in Royal Navy tactics because the USS Constitution 2-on-1 versus 1-on-1. So just so much history with the Constitution. It's really just unbelievable. My last question is about copper. Was there any copper that was used within the boat as the British did to kind of wax the French in the 1800s?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Copper sheathing went on to that hull from the very beginning and continues to be on it today. She had a lot of copper replaced during her most recent dry dock restoration, which occurred between 2015 and 2017. Copper plating onto the hulls of wooden ships was a huge game changer in the overall maritime world. Copper is resistant to a lot of kinds of marine growth and intrusion by marine life. And prior to that, wooden hulled sailing ships were literally being eaten away by marine worms that would burrow their way into that wooden hull, causing leaks.
Do you think Constitution will ever come out of the water the way Vasa has?
No, not at all. For starters, unlike Vasa, Constitution's still afloat and floating quite well. Thank you very much. No, she is in the water and underway on a regular basis each summer. Still doing, a turnaround and a sort of underway demonstration in Boston Harbor, leaving the dock, coming back under tow, mind you, and I imagine that will continue for the foreseeable future.
Well, wonderful. Carl, this was a lot of fun. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today.
Oh, no problem, Alex. It's great. Talk about it.
This was a lot of fun. Well, have a great day and happy spring.
Yeah, thanks. You too. Feel free to come on up. Things will be getting busy for the summer, both at the USS Constitution, the ship, and the museum.
So people should all go visit the USS Constitution Museum, of course. And you guys have a wonderful website. What's the specific address again?
You can reach us at USSCM, USS Constitution Museum.org. And there you'll find not only information about visiting the museum and visiting the ship, but you'll also find extensive access to the museum's information about the museum's collections, our database of crew members who served on USS Constitution. At the moment, our online presentation of crew is mostly from 1812, but the museum maintains a database of about 15,000 US sailors who served on Constitution at one point or another. And there's a number of other interactive exploratories. You can follow her on her cruises during the War of 1812.
And can our viewers donate to the museum online?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe so. Yeah, there's a collection to connections to our development and donations pages as well.
I urge our viewers to. Just such an essential part of American history.
Thank you.
Carl, it was a pleasure, and I hope we stay in touch and continue to chat naval history.
Yeah, definitely. Let me know what I can do.
Thank you. Be well.